U.S. to exchange ambassadors with Sudan, ending 23-year gap. At least 420,000 people displaced by floods in South Sudan. And more than 60% of Nigerians to suffer effects of heat waves. Hello and welcome to Africa Live. As always, great to have you with us. I'm Richard Cyril Unta, live from Nairobi. And for those of you joining us from across the continent and around the globe, we thank you for joining us. And tonight, I'm alongside my colleague Uche, who has our business headlines.
Thank you, Richard. And here's a look at what's coming up on Africa Live Biz. A lifeline for South African Airways as the government announces a $272 million boost. And OPEC looks at ways to manage oil production as demand drops. Of course, all that coming up within the program. For now, back to you, Richard.
Thanks a lot, Uche. We begin our bulletin in West Africa, where at least 58 migrants have drowned off the coast of Mauritania. The sinking is one of the deadliest to happen this year. Their boat came from the West African country, Gambia. It was headed to Spain's Canary Islands. Fewer ships had been using the passage since Spanish authorities stepped up patrols. The UN's migration agency says 83 survivors swam to shore. The International Organization for Migration is providing them with further assistance. South African President Cyril Ramaphosa is looking to strengthen economic ties in West Africa. Ramaphosa started his tour with a visit to Guinea. He is currently in Ghana and will end his tour in Togo. CGTN's Yolisa Njamela has more.
In 2018, South Africa and Equatorial Guinea marked 25 years since the formalization of diplomatic relations. Bilateral cooperation has spanned health, trade, manufacturing, infrastructure, industrial, as well as education and training. This working visit provides an opportunity for South Africa to explore new areas of cooperation with Guinea, to also promote increased trade and investment flows to the mutual benefit of the peoples of the two countries.
We have also agreed to expand relations further between our two countries, especially economic cooperation, so that our peoples can benefit from the relations between the two countries.
Ramaphosa wants the two countries to especially increase business trade.
At the commercial level, we noted with satisfaction that there are some 8 South African companies that are conducting business here and have invested here. We obviously would like to see more South African companies investing in Guinea, as well as to have an exchange of investments from Guinea to South Africa as well.
President Ramaphosa is also using the trip to engage his counterparts on the state of the continent's quest for peace and prosperity. This is in line with the aspirations of the African Union's transformative Agenda 2063, as well as reform of the global governance system. The visit comes ahead of South Africa's assumption of the African Union chairmanship in 2020. South Africa will be taking over from Egypt. Yolisa Njamela for CGTN in Johannesburg, South Africa.
Right, the United States and Sudan plan to begin exchanging ambassadors after a 23-year gap. The announcement came during Sudanese Prime Minister Abdallah Hamdok's first visit to Washington this week. The relationship between the two countries has improved since the overthrow of President Omar al-Bashir in April. However, Sudan remains on a list of countries deemed sponsors of terrorism. This designation makes it ineligible for debt relief and financing from international institutions. The country is also in need of beginning debt restructuring processes, but faces the challenges of accompanying sanctions from the labeling. During his visit, Prime Minister Abdallah Hamdok also stated that all those responsible for atrocities in Sudan will be held accountable. Meanwhile, Sudan says it is working on establishing judiciary structures that are independent and credible. Well, CGTN's Jagruti Dave joins us from Washington, D.C. for more on this story. Jagruti, thank you for joining us here on Africa Live. First things first, Jagruti, there seems to be signs of warming relations between Sudan and the U.S. during the PM's visit to Washington. What has changed? Talk to us.
It's really all to do with this new Prime Minister, Abdallah Hamdok. He is viewed as a more secular, a more progressive leader than his predecessor, Omar al-Bashir. And he is a renowned economist. He worked at the United Nations and he was educated internationally. University of Manchester was one of his places of education. So he is viewed differently. He is a part of an interim government that is overseeing this transition to a period of elections, hoping to be in 2022. And this is one of the main reasons why there has been this change of heart between Sudan and the United States, and which has led the State Department to announce this exchange of ambassadors for the first time in 23 years.
Well, the Prime Minister held discussions with officials in Washington, D.C. Could you briefly tell us what was discussed?
Yes, so some of the people that he was meeting, he met with many top-level U.S. officials from many, many departments. I'll name a couple. One of them is Steve Mnuchin, the Treasury Secretary, and the other is David Hale from the State Department. And the sorts of things that they have been discussing are really to do with getting, the main priority really is talks about trying to get Sudan off the list of state sponsors of terror. And related to that is getting them on a program, on a pathway to debt relief, on a pathway to refinancing, and these are the sorts of discussions they met. He met with education officials as well. So really wide-ranging discussions trying to bring Sudan back into the international fold, talking about this transition period.
Well, Jagruti, let's zero in on that. Sudan's Prime Minister has been advocating for the removal of Sudan from the list of state sponsors of terrorism, as you have mentioned. Has there been any developments in that regard?
This was Prime Minister Hamdok's primary aim, but it looks like that he will go back empty-handed because it takes a while for a country to be removed from the United States list of state sponsors of terror. This isn't something that can happen overnight or in a short few days. And someone called Cameron Hudson, who used to work at in the office of the U.S. envoy for Sudan, has been writing a piece in the Atlantic Council think tank, and he has been tweeting, and he is saying that it is right that the United States asks for reassurances about Sudan's political future. He says that the United States doesn't want to end up inadvertently funding nefarious elements within Sudan by de-escalating, by pushing this transition too early. But also he notes that the United States shouldn't take too long about this process because it could be a self-fulfilling prophecy that making the Sudan wait too long for debt relief, for this transition, could plunge this very fragile interim government into chaos, into disarray, into the arms of terrorists, which is something that the United States probably is very mindful of at this stage.
All right, Jagruti, Dave, thank you so much for talking to us from Washington. Many thanks for your insights. So, how did Sudan end up on the U.S. terror list? From Al-Qaeda to Janjaweed, Sudan has been implicated with groups that have been classified as terrorist networks, and the numbers are staggering. Here is the story.
A young Colonel Omar al-Bashir overthrew the democratically elected government of Prime Minister Sadiq al-Mahdi in 1989. By then, the conflict with southern rebels called Sudan People's Liberation Army had just entered its 6th year. Al-Bashir's regime inherited it. Al-Bashir's rise to power was backed by an Islamist cleric called Hassan al-Turabi. Al-Turabi was the then leader of the National Islamic Front, which successfully pushed for the imposition of strict Sharia laws in the Arab North. The party would later join the structures of Bashir's National Congress Party, which the new government is seeking to dismantle. The two politicians had what could be described as an interesting political ties. Sometimes the two would have fallouts. Al-Turabi was one of the people who would later play a leading role in convincing Khartoum to grant a safe haven to a terrorist organization called Al-Qaeda, which was then led by Osama bin Laden. Al-Qaeda had been formed by bin Laden in the aftermath of the war in Afghanistan. The group's first attack in the region was the August 1997 East African twin bombing of American embassies in Kenya and Tanzania. The conflict in the southern regions of Sudan was supported by various regional powers. In retaliation, The Bashir regime also allegedly sponsored various militias, including the Lord's Resistance Army and the Allied Defense Forces in Uganda, or ADF. ADF is still active in eastern DRC. The leadership in Khartoum was also accused of engineering a fallout within the SPLA, which saw Riek Machar form a splinter group which he named SPLM Al-Nasir. Machar's outfit was later blamed for the 1991 massacres of the Dinka people of the present-day South Sudan. Unfortunately, bad blood between the two groups would later define a civil war that befell newly independent South Sudan, with the Nuer and Dinka fighting for supremacy. In 2003, a conflict broke out in Darfur and South Kordofan states of Sudan. It was spearheaded by Justice and Equality and Sudan Liberation movements. The two groups pushed for the rights of the majority black populations. To counter this, Khartoum was claimed to have sponsored and armed a local Arab militia called Janjaweed. Atrocities committed by the group would later form the basis of then-President Omar al-Bashir's indictment by the International Criminal Court at The Hague. These and other groups that enjoyed Khartoum's support were later designated as terrorist organizations by the United States. Others have since been dropped. Khartoum's choice to dance with these groups is the reason behind America's decision to list Sudan as a state sponsor of terrorism, a move that the current Prime Minister is seeking to reverse. Penina Karibe, CGTN.
Cyclone Pawan is set to hit Somalia on Saturday. It is expected to make landfall as a weak tropical cyclone. This will make it the 8th cyclone formed over the North Indian Ocean this year. The last time 8 cyclones were formed in the area was in 1976 and 1987. Well, we are joined by CGTN's Abdulaziz Billo here in Nairobi, and of course Patrick Oyet in Juba. Let me start with you, Abdulaziz. First of all, welcome to Africa Live. Abdulaziz, give us an update on Cyclone Pawan.
Well, unlike previous cyclones that you've mentioned that happened in 1978, this one, authorities in Somalia say that they're fully aware that it's in focus, and they're trying to do their level best to try to mitigate its impact. Now, the country, Somalia itself, has been a regular a victim of climate change. In the past 3 years ago, in the past 3 years, we have had 3 successive cyclones, and Cyclone Pawan is expected to be the 3rd. So Somalia continues to become a main victim of climate change. But weather forecast in Somalia now, there's a heavy rain in parts of the country, especially in southern Somalia, and this Cyclone Pawan is expected to hit especially the northern parts of Somalia in Puntland and in major coastal cities around that area, and as far as Garowe, that is almost 500 kilometers from where weather forecasts are anticipating that this will happen. So authorities say that they're fully aware and that they'll try their level best to mitigate its impact.
All right, Abdulaziz, based on what you said Somalia is now a victim of climate change. Well, I don't know if this is good news or bad news, but it is classified as a weak tropical cyclone. But the question that really needs to be asked is, how prepared is the government for it?
Well, for now, according to weather forecast, we are hearing that it's surrounding the Arabian Sea, and it's expected to make a landfall in Puntland, that is northeastern Somalia, over the weekend. So authorities, they have come up with measures, including sending text messages to people living in remote areas to notify them that there will be heavy storms and accompanied by heavy rainfall, so that they can move from some of these areas. But then again, it's very hard for people to move from these areas because they have invested heavily there. They have their houses, they have their schools, hospitals, they have their homes there. So moving out from this area entirely to come back to urban centers or to safer areas is a big challenge for these communities, because they've been constantly moving time and again because of floods, because of droughts, now because of cyclone, and now they're expected now again to flee because of food insecurity. So it's a normal occurrence and a big challenge for authorities, but they are saying that this time round there will be less impact compared to 2018, where Cyclone Sagar caused massive devastation, especially in Somaliland and Puntland. And it's also not just Somalia that has been affected. We also have South Sudan that has been hit hard by deadly floods. Now we are joined live on studio by Patrick Oyet, the correspondent of CGTN in Juba. Now, Patrick, if you can tell us more about the heavy rains that have left hundreds of thousands in South Sudan in need of aid. Can you shed more light on the situation in your country?
Yes, Abdulaziz, thank you very much. You know, authorities here are saying the level of floods that has been witnessed this year is the biggest they have ever seen. And the UN is saying close to 1 million people have been displaced. These are people who have now lost their homes, they have lost their property, they have actually lost schools, they have lost hospitals that they used to go to, and they are now living on tiny patches of land that are not flooded. And remember, they do not have food because their crops have been washed away. The children who are supposed to have sat for their end of year exams have not sat for end of year. They are there, they do not have markets because even if the market may exist, the problem is that there is no actually anything to sell. And even if you have money, you don't have anything to buy. So they are depending on food aid from aid agencies. So the situation is very dire, and the government, of course, has declared a state of emergency. And for more on this, of course, we have a report, and the government says at least 420,000 people have been displaced by the floods, and Akobo is one of the hard-hit areas in the country. For more on this, Asta Tal has this report.
They returned home after years of civil unrest. Now they face another challenge as flooding has submerged their homes.
When we were displaced by the flooding, we felt sad because we had to leave everything behind. We need shelter, we need food. Now we are not getting those things because we had to leave our homes. I'm sleeping outside, which is not good.
The country continues to grapple with food insecurity. The floods have exacerbated the situation.
Obviously, the scale of need is perhaps more than anybody thought, and the real worry, to be honest, is further down the track in a few months' time. Yes, we can provide emergency support now, but these people are going to rely, or have been relying for years and years, on harvests. Those harvests are like to be badly affected, so there's going to be less food that they're going to grow themselves, and therefore they might be more dependent on food coming in from outside.
For now, humanitarian agencies are providing clean water, shelter, as well as medicine to combat the spread of waterborne diseases. Asta Tal, CGTN.
Yeah, now the challenge, according to aid agencies, is that actually, providing even aid to the people who are displaced is very difficult. And of course, they're asking for more money. They're saying that whatever they had budgeted for us, emergency fund, has been actually underestimated because the magnitude of the flooding is so high. And another challenge is that why they need a lot of money is that moving even food aid to these areas that have floods has become very difficult because roads are also washed away. So you cannot talk about road transport or land transport. You need to use actually air transport, and you cannot even use airdrop because the places are flooded. So you have to use helicopter to go and land on those tiny patches of land where these displaced people are living to try to get for them food aid. And then using helicopters also mean you cannot actually, carry so much food. So a lot of challenges, and yet children are also having problems now with things like diseases like pneumonia. There's also fear of waterborne diseases, breaking out. So lots of challenges here. But back to you, Abdulaziz. We also understand, as you said earlier, that rain is about to come to Somalia again in about 3 to 7 days. How prepared is the government in regard to this rain that is expected to hit Somalia again?
Well, Patrick, thank you very much. The situation is more of like similar to what you've mentioned in South Sudan. Rain forecast is expected to hit Somalia in the coming 1 week from now. But that rain is still ongoing in several parts of the country. And as you've mentioned in your report, food aid is being given to vulnerable communities using UN helicopters. The World Food Programme is delivering life-saving humanitarian assistance in some of the areas where airstrips and airports have been cut off. So it's very hard for authorities to present any assistance to communities in these areas. But also, there's also massive displacement of people. We are talking about the Shabelle River that has broken its banks in the town of Beledweyne, that is home to more than 300,000 people. And also, it's coming downstream to towards lower Shabelle region in areas of Balad, where people are now leaving their homes and going to other safer areas. But the biggest challenge of it all is the flooding is affecting the farming community. And just 3 months ago, Somalia was on the brink of food insecurity, on the brink of drought. And now, due to climate change, we now have devastating floods that is accompanied by a possible cyclone in in northeastern Somalia. And after that is when authorities are saying that they're trying their level best to ensure that families are not affected like previously. There have been less deaths compared to previous areas, but there's the biggest fear now is widespread waterborne diseases in that area. So I'll hand it over to you, Richard.
All right, once again, Abdullah Zabilos, thank you for joining us in the studio. And I'd also like to thank Patrick Oyet for bringing us the updates and keeping a close eye on this story. Moving on, more than 60% of Nigerians are now at risk from heat waves as a result of climate change. And that's according to a new report by the International Organization on Sustainable Energy, which says that more than 1 billion people are at risk in at least 12 African countries, including Nigeria. Ajek Mangut reports from Abuja.
Deji Adejumobi lives in this one-room apartment with his wife and children in the suburbs of Abuja. The 39-year-old carpenter says it has become increasingly uncomfortable for him and his family to sleep at night because of the hot weather conditions.
The heat isn't easy. My children cry at night because they can't sleep. My wife and I can't either, and there's no electricity. That's why I bought this hand fan to help us a bit.
According to the World Meteorological Organization, 2019 has been the warmest year in the last decade, and the Nigerian Meteorological Agency says most parts of the country will experience prolonged periods of abnormally hot weather in the coming weeks. Temperatures could go as high as 46 degrees Celsius. Anthony Anofurum is the former Director General of the Nigerian Meteorological Agency. He says the alarming level of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is to be blamed for the heat wave.
The concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere had reached an all-time high of about 408.7 parts per million. Never occurred before. And the fear is that it is growing. And so the more you have accumulation of these greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, the more the global warming increases.
Countries like Nigeria, which have been declared a climate change hotspot by the United Nations, are likely to see lesser crop yields and production, which will impact on food security.
Experts say the government has a big role to play in reducing the impacts.
What we should do is, one, increase public enlightenment. People need to be consistently and repeatedly reminded of the risks of this climate change and associated extreme weather phenomena. For the heat wave, of course, the medical people will tell us drink more water, stay out of direct sunlight, keep your environment as cool as possible.
Climate scientists have warned there is only about 12 years for global warming to be kept to a maximum of 1.5 degrees Celsius. For now, Nigerians like Deji will have to find ways of keeping themselves cool during the hot period. Ajek Mangut, CGTN, Abuja.
A lot more stories coming your way after the break, including French president gives conditions for continued military operation in the Sahel region. And we look at how a volunteer in Uganda is helping displaced persons earn a living.
Each day, there are millions of stories. Each one can open new perspectives, new possibilities. Wherever you look, we are there to see, discover, explore. We put the pieces together to find what really matters to you, all around the world, all around the clock. Our reporters are at home across the globe. From our headquarters in Beijing and production centers in Washington, Nairobi, and London. China Global Television Network. Stories from across the globe, reaching people across the globe. CGTN. See the difference.
Welcome back. The Speaker of the U.S. House of Representatives, Nancy Pelosi, has announced that the House will file impeachment charges against President Donald Trump. After weeks of hearing by the House Intelligence and Judiciary Committees, Pelosi found enough support among House Democrats to move forward with impeaching the president. Trump is accused of seeking foreign help to investigate a domestic political opponent.
Our democracy is what is at stake. The president leaves us no choice but to act because he is trying to corrupt, once again, the election for his own benefit. The president has engaged in abuse of power, undermining our national security and jeopardizing the integrity of our elections. His actions are in defiance of the vision of our founders and the oath of office that he takes to preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States.
The Hong Kong Legislative Council has rejected a motion launched by 25 opposition lawmakers to remove Chief Executive Carrie Lam from office. Chief Secretary Matthew Chuang said there was no evidence of illegality or dereliction of duty in decisions made by Lam. He called on opposition parties to stop supporting the use of violence during protests. Chuang added complaints against the police should be dealt with in accordance with the established system, and there should not be a separate independent investigation committee to look into charges made against Lam. And President Emmanuel Macron has asked West African leaders to dismiss growing anti-French sentiment across the region. Macron says this is a condition for continued military engagement with France. The former colonial power has the largest foreign military presence carrying out counterinsurgency operations in Mali and the wider Sahel region, but it has been criticized for failing to restore stability.
French President Emmanuel Macron is trying to save face at a time when his country has come under heavy criticism. There are around 4,500 French troops stationed in the Sahel, but security continues to deteriorate. Just last week, 13 French soldiers were killed in Mali. Macron now says his country needs a rethink on this engagement.
We must in the immediate term requalify the framework and political conditions of our intervention in the Sahel. First and foremost, with the 5 African G5 Sahel member states, I expect them to clarify and formalize their demands on France and the international community. Do they want our presence? Do they need us? I want clear and confident answers to these questions. I can't and I don't want to have French troops on the ground anywhere in the Sahel when there is ambiguity by authorities towards anti-French movements and sometimes comments carried by politicians.
There have also been growing protests demanding France to leave or accusing it of being in the region for economic reasons. France has responded saying it's there strictly for security of the region. It has also organized a summit to debate the intervention.
In order to make these clarifications, I have invited the 5 African heads of state concerned and involved in the G5 Sahel to Pau on December 16th to be able to provide precise answers on these points. The answers are today a necessary condition for our maintenance.
Security across the Sahel has moved from bad to worse in recent months. Militants linked to Al-Qaeda and ISIL have gained more territory, stoking violence in the region. Chamrono, CGTN.
And to get more perspective on this, we are joined by CGTN's Ajek Mangut in Abuja. Ajek, thanks for joining us once again here on Africa Live. Now, President Emmanuel Macron demanded West African leaders to dismiss growing anti-French sentiments across the region if they wanted France's military to continue its operations against Islamist militants. What has the reaction been of West African leaders?
Well, Richard, we've not had any reaction from leaders of West African countries in the Sahel
like Burkina Faso, Mali, and Chad, where more than 4,000 French troops have been fighting an Islamist militancy since 2013. But what we do know is that when the 13 French soldiers died from a helicopter crash, the president of Mali, that's Boubacar Keita, expressed his condolence to the French government, saying that their loss is not just to France, but also to Mali, because they have been fighting the Islamist militants in that country. And well, we might see some sort of reaction in coming days or weeks, but it's not clear if or when that will come.
All right, Ajay, can you unpack it for us? Why is there anti-French sentiment growing in the region?
Okay, like that report said, there have been increased attacks in that region. We've seen the militants in the region being affiliated to the Islamic State in the Middle East. Some analysts and experts have even said, have put the number of attacks to more than 200. We've seen also a recent attack in Mali, which has been the worst hit by this Islamist militants, where 49 soldiers were killed, and that attack has been seen tagged the deadliest attack in that region, and also the recent helicopter crash, where 13 soldiers have died. So many people in the region, like Burkina Faso, Chad, have raised concerns that instead of this insurgency reducing, it seems to be increasing with these affiliations to militants in the Middle East. And so there are also speculations and questions as to the intentions of the French soldiers in that region. And some have said that it is not just for security reasons, but they have other ulterior motives or economic reasons for being in that country.
Jack Mangood, thank you so much for your insight and analysis. Let's leave it there for now. Thank you for talking to us. Moving on, in Uganda, a volunteer is equipping refugees with life skills to help them make a living in the capital, Kampala. Catherine Kabanyana trains over 100 urban refugee girls in craft making. CGTN's Hilary Ayasega has this report.
Stitching lives together. For the past 4 years, Catherine Kabanyana has been volunteering with the charity Soccer Without Borders.
For their families to move in Kampala, try to find small businesses to raise their family, they give up relief. So they go through a lot of situations, traumatic events. Some of them end up staying with families they are not related to.
Kabanyana spends much of her time training these young people on how to make crafts. She believes learning this skill could help them become future entrepreneurs. They design bags using pieces of African fabric, old sacks, and plastic bottle tops. The products are then sold at a local crafts market.
We make bags, and when we have visitors come to our program, we sell the bags, and then after selling the bags, we use the proceeds to buy new material and buy them a sanitary pack.
It's helped equip these girls with some valuable skills.
I have even made a earring for my mom. She always wears it at Sunday, a necklace. It makes me happy to see that she's wearing something I made on my own.
Uganda is home to about 1.5 million refugees. Close to 100,000 of them live in cities. And as this number grows, so will the demand for many of them to learn a skill or a trade, allowing them to build a future here in Uganda. Hilary Ayasega, CGTN, Kampala.
And for more on International Volunteer Day, we are joined by Doreen Ninina Heatwave, Africa Union and East Africa Director of the One campaign. Doreen, thank you for taking time out to speak to us. Well, my first question is, how important is the International Volunteer Day? Break it down for us.
Thank you very much for this invitation. I'm really happy to be here. So the International Volunteers Day is really important for three main reasons. The first one, it's important to promote volunteerism. We were showcasing the work of our volunteers at the event where we were having earlier on. And then the second one is that we are also trying to get the government to engage and help these volunteers. And finally, it's also important to recognize these volunteers, give them awards for the work that they are doing in their communities. So at One Campaign, we are an advocacy and campaign organization of millions of members who are taking action to end extreme poverty. And we work with millions of members who are actually volunteers in their communities. And these are the people who lobby political leaders, run grassroots campaigns, and also hold government accountable. They also work towards getting more investment for key areas like agriculture, health, and education. So it was really important for us to associate ourselves with the UNV just to celebrate these amazing people in the communities.
So you would say volunteerism is playing a great role in promoting sustainable development?
Yes, absolutely. And we all agree that sustainable development will not be achieved if we don't include everybody and we don't leave no one behind. So volunteerism is very important because people are becoming actors of their own development. They are not waiting for solutions to come from afar, but also it creates cohesion among people when they sit down together and find the solution to common challenges. And that's really important for them to sit down together, look at their challenges and find the solutions.
Well, how much more can the government do to assist you? Now, you touched upon some very important points, but my final question to you is how significant is volunteerism to vulnerable and marginalized groups? You touched upon that a little bit. Can you unpack that more for us?
Okay, vulnerable groups are defined differently depending in the countries and region. So vulnerable groups can be women and girls in some parts. Vulnerable group can also be the disabled. It's important to put them together and be all inclusive because this is the theme of this year, inclusiveness. So they also need to be part of and parcel of this agenda. So we will not be able to achieve if they are not brought on board.
All right, let's leave it there. We have so many questions, but so little time. But thank you for spending time with us here on Africa Live. That's Doreen Nina Haswe, Africa Union and East Africa Director, speaking to us right here in Nairobi. Moving on, the 5th Science Forum for South Africa is currently underway in Pretoria. The event is taking place under the theme Igniting Conversations about Science for Innovation with Impact. The gathering has over the years been used as a platform to interrogate the role of science in the development of countries. CGTN's Yolisa Njamela has more.
Over 3,000 researchers, scientists, and policymakers travel annually from all around the world to be part of this science forum. Held under the theme Igniting Conversations about Science for Innovation with Impact, the event has also drawn close to 300 speakers and panelists from more than 40 countries. They will deliberate on the role of science and innovation in societies over a couple of days.
The forum is a celebration of international cooperation, but more importantly, also fertile ground and an incubator for the development of new partnership initiatives. We want to ensure that this system of innovation is responsive to the needs of our society. So open science should not only be about disclosing data that we have collected and sharing it, but open science must also literally mean it must be open to all. Science must be open to all.
Over the years, the forum has become one of Africa's foremost platforms to interrogate the role science should play in our societies and in the development of African countries.
We know what technology, innovation, and aspirations of Africa are. They are clearly articulated in Agenda 2063. Africa should therefore not be in a position where the continent's priorities are railroaded or deflected in response to agendas elsewhere. I am pleased that Africa is actively driving its science, technology, and innovation agendas, because only then do we get the right science being done by the right people in the right places for the right reasons.
The Education, Science and Technology Ministry believes that the Science Forum is a powerful instrument and platform for science diplomacy, that it can be used, for instance, for cooperations on scientific projects within the continent. Projects such as how the continent can harness the sun as a source of energy.
How do we harness our sun such that the African continent does not only enjoy light during the day, but can actually enjoy light whenever it wants it?
The forum ends on Friday. Yulisa Njamela for CGTN in Pretoria, South Africa.
Well, this is Africa Live on CGTN. It's time now to check in with Uche for the latest in business. Uche.
Thanks, Richard. And coming up on Africa Live Biz. A lifeline for South African Airways as the government announces a $272 million boost. And OPEC looks at ways to manage oil production as demand drops.
Images may appear to be identical, but looks can be deceiving. The difference is not always obvious. It has to be discovered. There are always different sides to a story. We put the focus on the details. To see more, to understand better. CGTN. See the difference.
Now, South African Airways is likely to get a $136 million boost from the government and another $136 million from existing lenders. Now, on Thursday, the airline entered business rescue proceedings. The extra funds will be provided for in a fiscally neutral manner with a full recovery of capital and interest on existing debt not impacted by the rescue proceedings. Now, in a business rescue process, a specialist administrator takes control of a company with the aim of rehabilitating it to improve its chance of survival. The embattled airline has not made any profit since 2011, and it has been dependent on government bailouts. It suffered an employee strike last month that forced it to cancel hundreds of flights, which of course further pushed it to the brink of collapse. Meanwhile, Uganda plans to borrow about $661 million from international banks in order to plug a hole in its 2019 and 2020 budget. This, of course, is after domestic revenue collections fell short by about 9%. That's amid delays in implementation of some planned tax-generating measures. The move could heighten concerns about Uganda's growing debt pile. The International Monetary Fund has warned that the country's debt could likely surpass 50% of GDP in 2021 and 2022. Now, the country's financial year starts in July. According to documents published by the Finance Ministry, Uganda plans to borrow the money from a local unit of South Africa's Standard Bank and Regional Trade and Development Bank. And South Sudanese business people are saying the effect of the 5-year civil war is ruining their businesses. Many are still finding it difficult to transfer money from South Sudan to neighboring countries. The political rival factions have agreed to form a new unity government by February next year. But of course, there are still conditions attached to that unity government. Here's CGTN's Patrick Oyet with more on that.
Cosmas Gombura runs a sky tour travel and aviation. He specializes in flights within South Sudan and northern Uganda. He also books people on international flights. Cosmas says transfer of hard currency from South Sudan to some of the neighboring countries is difficult. It is just one of the many challenges business people here face.
Most of these planes of ours here are Kenyan registered, you could say. A lot of our planes are got from Kenya and Tanzania that comes from it. What this means is after a certain period that the plane has operated in South Sudan, it has to go back to Kenya for services. Currently, South Sudan, we don't have the capacity.
South Sudan's 5-year-old civil war has made business difficult. South Africa's deputy president is in South Sudan at the moment in the latest move by the African Union to try and push the peace process forward. David Mabuza says he believes that South Sudanese leaders can settle their differences.
I'm coming here to people that I trust.
I'm sitting amongst yourselves because I trust that finally we'll find a solution.
The formation of the new government in South Sudan is tied on some conditions which are still being contested. One of the issues of disagreement is on how many states South Sudan should have. The opposition says it wants the states to be reverted back to 10 that existed before war broke out in 2013. South Sudan's government wants to maintain the current 32 states, saying it was in the interest of the people of taking services and governance closer to the rural communities. The East African Regional Body, IGAD, says the issue of the number of states could be easier to resolve if leaders on both sides of the political divide could compromise for the good of the people of South Sudan.
The issue of number of states and their boundaries does not require resources or logistical arrangements. All it requires is a political will, the will to discuss and compromise in good faith.
As South Sudan's government and opposition leaders try to sort out the contentious issues in the peace deal, traders here say their businesses may continue to suffer the impact of the conflict. Patrick Koyet, CGTN, Juba, South Sudan.
And on the international front, book runners for Saudi Aramco have recommended that the oil giant go with $8.5 per share in its initial public offering. Now, that could mean that Aramco will have a market valuation of about $1.7 trillion, comfortably overtaking Apple as the world's most valuable listed firm. If the deal is priced at the top, Aramco's IPO will exceed the $25 billion, which it raised in the listing of China's Alibaba Group in 2014, which of course was the biggest flotation till date. Riyadh, of course, has scaled back its original IPO plans, scrapping an international roadshow to focus instead on marketing the offering to Saudi investors and wealthy Gulf Arab allies. It has stayed quiet on when or where it might list the stock abroad. The deal is the centerpiece of the Saudi Crown Prince's plans to diversify the economy away from its reliance on oil. Meanwhile, OPEC is looking at ways to manage its oil production for the coming year. In a meeting at its headquarters in Vienna, the organization has been considering ways to stabilize the market amid falling oil prices, which of course are due to decreased demand. Now, as 2020 approaches, OPEC also faces a number of other challenges. With more details, here's CGTN's Natalie Carney reporting from Vienna.
When oil-producing countries first established OPEC nearly 6 decades ago, they were essentially the only players in town. But a lot has changed since 1960. Today, the production of crude oil by the companies themselves and the discovery of shale oil has reduced OPEC's share of the world's oil supply from 70% to roughly 25%.
What has changed the nature and the business altogether in the last 10 years was the emergence of shale oil. Because shale oil is a kind of production that is more short-term in terms of investment cycle. You can very quickly switch on and switch off the production. And that was a challenge for OPEC.
The U.S., a non-OPEC member, has increased its production of shale oil to an average of 12.4 million barrels a day, reducing the dependency on imports while also adding to the export market. The U.S.-China trade dispute is also a threat to oil prices in general.
The dispute between US and China has a big impact on the global growth. Yeah? The oil demand growth is slowing down because the global trade is slowing down. And all that is a problem because obviously when oil demand is not growing, but on the other side supply is growing, yeah? That's not good for prices.
In July, OPEC members extended their production cuts of 1.2 million barrels per day for a further 9 months in an effort to ward off tumbling prices. And it is expected that the organization will further extend those cuts, retaining production targets through 2020 at this week's meeting.
While these cuts attempt to balance and stabilize the market, some smaller OPEC members are affected more adversely. Qatar left the organization at the beginning of 2019, and Ecuador is expected to do the same in January to pursue their own oil policies. Yet despite the challenges, many believe OPEC remains a relevant organization.
I believe strongly that OPEC is a cooperation of sovereign countries, and these countries have agreed to work together. And I think that is the basis. Then that's the success OPEC has recorded over the years. And I wouldn't agree that OPEC is dying. If there are 24 countries committed to working together. And if those countries are still committed to that cooperation, I don't see where death is coming in that area.
Look, OPEC is relevant, and OPEC has a good job that they're doing.
OPEC members could implement further oil production cuts in the near future. Yet as long as prices remain moderate and stable, investment into more costly shale oil will decrease, a trend that would likely play out favorably for OPEC.
Meanwhile, a protest against changes to France's pension system has brought parts of the country to a grinding halt. On Thursday, unions embarked on a nationwide strike, which was aimed at forcing President Emmanuel Macron to abandon plans to overhaul the country's pension system. Now, Macron says he wants to simplify France's pension system, which comprises of more than 40 different plans with different retirement ages and benefits. As a result, he now wants a single points-based system under which, for each euro contributed, every pensioner has equal rights. However, workers argue that the proposed reforms will make them work longer for smaller pensions. Well, that's all for now on Africa Live Biz, but coming up later on Global Business Africa, we stay with South African Airways and, of course, its latest rescue plan. All that coming up top of the hour. For now, back to you, Richard.
Thanks a lot, Uche. You are watching Africa Live on CGTN. Guess what? We've got your sports news coming up after the break. Here's a look at what's ahead. Grassroots football making inroads within Nigerian communities.
How would you create your legend? On the fields, on the tracks, in the arenas of Africa. Were you born to be a player? Could this moment be yours?